Good evening. I'm Isaac Ben Ezra, host, co-producer of Conversations, now in its 13th year. This is not Charlie Rose. This is one of a kind. And with me is Carol Gray, who was with us last week. We're doing a series on Carol and Jeff's and Cameron's visit to Egypt for 10 months at the height of the revolution, the beginning of the revolution. And this is the second in the series of 3. And tonight we're going to explore the religious factions and where the revolution stands at this point. Obviously, the military coup is controlling what's going on to this day. So this is a work in progress, and I'm delighted to have Carol back.
Thanks,
Carol, let's get right into it.
Okay.
But remind people about the trip with the families.
Sure.
And the fellowship.
Yeah, so my husband and my son, who was then 5 years old, went to Cairo, and we went because I had received a scholarship. I was a Rotary International Ambassadorial Scholar, so that's what brought us to Cairo for the academic year. And while I was there, the revolution broke out, and we'd been there about 5 months when the revolution started. And I also, after the revolution ended, I was doing volunteer work with a human rights organization, and I applied for and received a $3,000 grant from American University in Cairo to do the oral history of that organization and its role in the revolution.
What was the role of this group?
So this group was called the Hisham Mubarak Law Center, and they have been on the cutting edge of human rights for more than a decade. And during the revolution, the Front to Defend Egyptian Protesters was housed at their office, and they were open 24 hours a day during the revolution. Protesters would come back and forth to the office. They were getting medical supplies, providing medical supplies, hundreds of blankets to the square. Doctors were patching people up who were coming back and forth to this office. So they were. And one of the most important things is they were protesters who'd been arrested. They were helping to track where those people were brought. They were having lawyers go meet with them when they were at the prosecutor's office to be questioned. And so they're a safety net and one of the hubs for organizers.
Did they serve medically and otherwise in terms of the judicious issues, all of the groups? Islamic as well as
they do, and I'm glad you mentioned that, because several people, when I interviewed the entire staff, they have staff in Cairo, also staff in Aswan, and I also interviewed some of the human rights advocates in London working with Amnesty International about them. And one of the things that everyone commented on is they would represent anyone who had had their human rights violated, whether it was an Islamic person or a Christian person. And in that office, they sometimes called it the House of the Nation, because all groups knew they could get their rights protected and advocated for from that office. So and it was all free, by the way. They provide free representation.
This is one moment in time where no matter what your religion was, you came together because the central issue, and there was agreement, it was almost unanimous, that the system had to go with Mubarak. Mubarak had to go.
Yeah, it wasn't always unanimous, but
of course we see it now. But
there was overwhelming support.
But at that point, they were not divided significantly. They were able to function as a unified group.
I'd say one of the big differences was when Mubarak resigned, Egyptian people placed great faith in the military, and they were very well respected, as opposed to, say, the police, who were very disliked within Egyptian people in general. But when the military came to Tahrir Square, the protesters thought, we're saved. They're going to rescue us. They're going to implement democracy. The military will make sure things go well and appropriately. And it wasn't until later that people started to realize that the military being in charge is problematic. The New York Times was reported to say that the Egyptians were starting to realize that the body that's been entrusted to implement the revolution is not the least bit revolutionary. And that was the case with the military. And so then schisms started to develop in the sense that a lot of the protesters said, wait a second, the military is still detaining people that are coming to the square, and there were a lot of crackdowns in the square. In December in particular, people probably saw that the military was attacking the square. Sometimes people were being shot at with live ammunition. Dozens of people were being killed, beaten, like in the head. And I just was reading one article about, I interviewed many people involved in the human rights community. So when I read the newspapers from Egypt, I'll often see their names mentioned. And one of the people I interviewed got his eye poked out during one of these assaults on the square from the military. And he said that it seemed like they were deliberately trying to, it was, I believe, a rubber bullet that shot him in the eye. And he said 35 other people also got their eyes basically eliminated by being shot in the eye. And I noticed some of the videos, the military was beating people in the head. I mean,
what did you see?
So we were there until June. So these latest crackdowns just started happening in December. We were not there then, but I've been watching it all on the news. Okay. But when I was there, the military was in general, not being aggressive towards the people, the protesters.
But there were other groups that were.
Yes, there were. So what would happen is the military came to the square, but then they would, when the thugs, who were often pro-Mubarak people, or they were sometimes police in plain clothes, when the thugs would come to the square and attack the protesters, the military would stand by and do nothing. To the point where there were stories that that one military soldier was just tears running down his face as he watched people get beat, like literally some of them perhaps to death in front of his eyes. They obviously had an order not to intervene. There was even a report that some military soldier was trying to shoot himself because there was massive violence going on and they weren't intervening to stop it. So,
did some of the soldiers come over to the revolution?
Some did, right. And then there was the concern, what's going to happen to these soldiers? Are their lives at risk because they crossed over to support the protesters? And there was this one night in the middle of the revolution, Bloody Wednesday, and I believe it was February 2nd. It was right in the middle of the revolution. The revolution started on January 25th and ended on February 11th. And I remember watching on TV. I didn't go to the square at nighttime. During the revolution, it seemed safer not to. But this particular night, there was an attack being mounted, and the pro-Mubarak people, or maybe they were undercover police officers. It's hard to tell, plainclothes officers. Anyway, people were attacking the square, and no one was protecting the protesters, and they were literally going on tops of rooftops and throwing cinder blocks and throwing furniture, chairs down on the protesters from multi-stories high. And I was just, at 2 in the morning, I was watching this live, and I'd been in the square, I think maybe even earlier that day, but you knew people were dying. I mean, you can't throw cinder blocks down at crowds of people and have people not die. And then there were reports that there were people outside of the perimeter who were wearing black ski masks who were shooting out the lamps. And so we thought they're just going to start shooting people. And in fact, they did shoot a couple people, just got shot in the head that night.
So we know there were literally thousands of casualties and also thousands of imprisoned.
Actually, thousands imprisoned, but the death count was a little, when we left, it was a little over 800. So it's not quite as bad as Syria, but imprisonments, definitely thousands. And not just, the whole judicial system was affected and has continued to be affected. For example, when the military came to power, they said, we're going to end the state of emergency. The state of emergency has allowed civil rights to be curtailed for 30 years. It's been almost, in effect, nonstop for 30 years. And basically, even though the Constitution says you have the right to voice your opinion and to have freedom of the press and things of that sort, those rights have been suspended because of the state of emergency. And also, So the military came and they said they'd lift the state of emergency. Well, they didn't, except very recently I read that they were announcing that it was either about to be lifted or was going to be lifting on the anniversary of the revolution. I think they were very worried that there would be a massive protest on the anniversary, which was just happened, January 25th. But another thing that the military kept doing was all the thousands of people who are getting arrested, many of them are being given military tribunals instead of civilian trials. And that's a big point, because these military tribunals, sometimes they happen in the middle of the night. Sometimes the lawyers aren't allowed to be there or aren't even notified. It's maybe 20-minute trials that result in 3 to 5 year sentences or more. So these military trials, under Mubarak, the former president, in those 30 years, there were maybe 2,000 civilians tried in military courts. After the revolution, about 12,000. So it's skyrocketed. The number, so the military courts were being used to just send protesters and people who might write critical things of the military to send them away.
And this is the status in Egypt today.
They have announced recently that they, I think, are going to shift away from military courts. But up until like through December, the military tribunals were still being used. And this is a really serious issue.
And then, didn't we just have an election?
So there was just an election, and it was for parliament. The presidential election has not yet happened, but is supposed to be happening, I believe, early part of this summer. But the parliamentary election, the Islamist candidates swept. The parliament is very important right now because Egypt is going to be writing a new constitution. Under the procedure that was set up shortly after the revolution, the new constitution would be drafted by what's called a constituent assembly, which is a group of 100 people who are selected by parliament. So who's in parliament right now matters a lot, maybe more than any other time in history.
And what was the breakdown?
So the breakdown is the Muslim Brotherhood got, I think, a little over 45% of the vote for parliament, and the Salafis, this was the surprise part, the Salafis, who are more conservative in terms of Islamic conservatism than the Brotherhood, they got about 20 to 25%. So the collective Islamic vote was a little over 75%. That's a pretty big sweep. Now that said, religion is a very complicated thing in Egypt, and just because people are voting for the Brotherhood doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to become an Islamic state like, say, Saudi Arabia. The Brotherhood offers a lot of social services to people. So the schools the public schools are pretty atrocious. Like, you might have classes of 100 kids in this class. So a lot of parents want to get private tutoring. Well, they can get that in the mosque, and the Brotherhood helps with that. The Brotherhood might supply groceries to people. The Brotherhood helps build clinics or schools. So the Brotherhood provides various services. So people voting for them might be voting for them because they see that they can get things done, make real things happen in their lives. It doesn't necessarily mean they want a more conservative state in terms of Islam. Although part of the platform of the Muslim Brotherhood is that they want an Islamic state. Now, in decades past, the Brotherhood had been advocating violence, but they have renounced violence now. And that was about a decade or so ago that they renounced violence. But the other thing about the Brotherhood is they're one of the most organized political parties. So, and this is part of the problem with the protesters. The protesters, they were in the square and they were demonstrating and giving their lives, but they didn't have a political machine, and the Brotherhood did. Which is ironic because in 2005, when the Brotherhood ran for parliament, they were a banned party. They weren't even legally allowed to run, but they still ran as independent candidates, and they still got, I think, about 20 to 25% of the vote back in 2005. So even being a banned party, they were able to mobilize enough people to go vote that they could still get a pretty respectable margin in parliament. Anyway, but the Salafis are a different story. They are much more extreme, and that was the bigger surprise about these elections, was that they obtained more than 20% of the vote. People didn't really expect that. And they have been quite militant. I believe they were the ones, when our family was visiting some of the historic sites, like the Valley of the Kings down in Luxor in the southern part, we couldn't get back home to Cairo because the railroad tracks had been blocked by some militant Islamic movement. I believe it was the Salafis. And so they just shut down the whole railroad system of the country. So they're more militant, they're more conservative. And it'll be interesting to see what happens with these two groups. How do they govern? Now, I should point out the Brotherhood has said right after during the revolution, they said, we will not run a presidential candidate. And I think they said that because they wanted to reassure the United States, look, we're not trying to take over and make this an Islamic state. We're not even going to run a candidate for president, so don't worry and let the revolution succeed. And it worked, and I think it did make some people feel a little more relaxed that the Brotherhood was not running a candidate for president. But meanwhile, another effect of this sweep is that Baradei, who was one of the lead presidential candidates and who is a candidate that was very much liked by the West, he's pulled out of his presidential bid. And I think he realizes that, with a sweep of 75% of the Islamists, he doesn't have much of a chance, I think he sees. But Baradei, a lot of the people, progressives, really liked him. He was someone who won the Nobel Peace Prize for his work with the atomic
nuclear,
exactly, the monitoring group, the IAEA. Anyway, but the whole religion angle is very complicated and not what we're used to here. And I could go into that in a little more detail if you'd like. Or
well, let's put a closure on just a very brief commentary on where things stand today politically, and then we can go into all of the religious factors that are contributing to the politics.
Yeah, well, so where things stand today is that the military is still in charge. They may be until the presidential election happens. There have been massive protests still in the square. In December, in particular, there were thousands of people taken to the square demanding that the military let a civilian committee take over until the presidential elections. And there's precedent for this. In Libya, that's what happened. You don't have to have the military be in charge. You could have a civilian transitional government. And that's what many people were demanding. And those demands were met with very violent crackdowns, which I think left a lot of people somewhat disillusioned. Not just in terms of the crackdowns, like dozens of people being killed, and people could see this is the military doing this. Because previously, I don't think many Egyptians would never even believe that the military was capable of this. So it's been quite an eye-opener. But also, even in terms of torture, the military, it was, I believe, this past summer, they had cleared the square at one point, and I might have mentioned this in the previous talk, that they were reported to have committed torture, like electrocution, virginity tests on women, which human rights groups say is ludicrous and a form of torture. And they were sued, actually, by this human rights organization that I did volunteer work with. They, in conjunction with other groups working against torture in Egypt, sued to say that, went to the high court to say what the military did with these virginity tests was absolutely illegal, it violates their human rights, and they won. So the court has been somewhat of an independent force at times. When you get into the civilian court, military court is a different story. But so then what happened, like within days of that verdict saying the military was wrong to have tortured these young women with these virginity tests, there were various human rights organizations that were raided. And there were a couple that were American, I think 1 or 2 German, a couple of Egyptian. So there's been a severe crackdown on human rights organizations, not just in terms of raiding the offices, but also in terms of investigating where is their funding coming from, looking at the personal accounts of people who run the organizations. There's been an effort to try to say all the discontent is foreign provocateurs.
Sounds like Syria now.
Well, there's common threads, and so this idea to try to discredit these human rights organizations by saying they're just agents of foreign governments was a common theme even during the revolution, when the Hisham Mubarak Law Center was raided in the middle of the revolution and 37 people were arrested. There were people screaming that they were agents of Israel, and that in Egypt is enough to get you to get the public very angry. And when the people from the Hisham Mubarak Law Center were put in these vans to be taken away, there was an angry mob rocking the van, and people were afraid they might just pound in the windows, and they were accusing them of being Israeli agents.
Let's take a minute to pause. In the few minutes that we have left in this session, it's amazing that we really we touched on the idea that we were going to look at the history of the religion and its impact. And this seems to be a virus that's attacked the whole world for centuries. We're going to get into that in the next session,
okay,
because time is running out.
Yes.
Your family, the last minute or two, how did they feel about the trip?
So they, I think we all had an amazing year, and completely not what we expected originally. We went to Egypt because it was a very safe place, and originally I was scheduled to do the Rotary Scholarship in Ghana, but I realized that the malaria, actually my husband pointed out, malaria is very dangerous for children my son's age, and it's one of the highest causes of death for that age group. So I told Rotary we couldn't go to Ghana, it was too risky for my son, and they were kind enough to let me pick any other country in Africa. So I looked for a non-malarial country, so north of the Sahara Desert, because sub-Saharan is malarial, and I looked for something that was safe. and then little did we know that whole region was going to erupt. But anyway, we felt like we were safe in our apartment, and I think for my husband and my son, it was an amazing experience. To have a front row seat to one of the biggest events of the century. I really couldn't have planned a better year.
Do you think it was as interesting as being on the library board of trustees?
Being a library, well, that also is
interesting. Did that pale in comparison?
They're very different, but equally rewarding.
Well, I suggest a reminder that we've been talking with Carol Gray, who's a member of the Board of Trustees at the Jones Library in Amherst, and we look forward to a third session where we're really going to get into a very strange question, the religious factors that seem to be central. And we're going to have a front row seat, because it is not clear that Egypt will not be another Syria. And for more information, stay tuned. So this is Isaac Ben-Ezra Conversations, thanking Carol once again. And we'll see you next week at this time. And thanks to the ACTV, student volunteers, staff. As always, this comes to you because ACTV is your instrument for having a voice. Good night.
Good night.
We're having a little addition to the part 2, since we still have some time. I'm with Carol Gray, once again, Board of Trustees here at Amherst, and just come back from a trip with her family to Egypt, and was a visual party, in a sense, to a historic situation in the Middle East. Carol, you know, and others are aware of the historical importance that Egypt has placed as far as the United States is concerned. And that's been reflected by billions and billions of taxpayer dollars going to the military in Egypt, which is now being used against the people. Do you want to comment about how the people on the street see that continuation?
Sure, yeah.
And how it would affect possibly the outcome of a revolution which has not ended, but it's really just beginning?
Yes, so the United States gives $1.3 billion a year to the Egyptian military, directly to the military. And it's my understanding that the military budget doesn't even go through Parliament. It goes straight to the military. So the military is like a state within the state in Egypt. Now, the reason that the U.S. gives this money is because Egypt has been a very important strategic foothold for the United States, and it's been the place where peace has been brokered between Egypt and Israel, the Camp David Accord. So there's a long history of U.S. involvement, and it could be a constructive U.S. involvement. But during the revolution, it was interesting to see what the United States government was doing, because I was watching it very carefully. Anytime there was a speech made by Obama or by Hillary Clinton or by anyone representing them, I wanted to know what it said, because that might affect how I was treated in the square later that day, because Egyptians knew what the U.S. government was saying. And there were times when Hillary Clinton would be saying, we just want there to be no violence on either side, as if all sides were equal, when in fact protesters were being shot at with tear gas and rubber bullets and sometimes live ammunition, and it was not all equal. The violence was very much against the protesters, and the protesters by and large were peaceful throughout. But until Mubarak resigned, the U.S. government never actually said, we support the protesters and they are pro-democracy protesters. They were always labeled anti-Mubarak protesters, which I thought didn't give them the legitimacy that they deserve. They were pro-democracy protesters, and had the U.S. come out and said that, and said, we support their movement, it would have helped. And the Egyptians were looking for that. Egyptians really love Americans by and large, and we were always treated very well. But there were also people who didn't appreciate the U.S. government position during the revolution. And I took a picture of one sign in the square that was criticizing the U.S. hypocrisy, to be about democracy but not give aid to the democracy protesters. Seemed hypocritical.
You know, on that note, we're going to save our conversation for part 3.
Sure.
But it's important to note that the U.S. not only continues to have a role, but the American people and world opinion can come in here too. If we want to see the continuation of a peaceful revolution and democracy, the opportunity for some democracy in Egypt, American foreign policy may be critical. Thank you, and we'll see you next week, Carol.
Okay, thanks, Isaac.
Good night. Good night.